Good day. Today is Wednesday, 26th March 2025, and as you will note, I have again problems with my voice. I don't feel at all ill, but somehow or other this has crept over me over the last 24 hours. I suspect that it's probably connected with the many programs I've been doing, not just on this channel, but in other places and other commitments I've had to make. And anyway, one way or the other, my voice is not quite as strong as I would like. Having said that, I've decided to put a little more strain on it today by doing this program because, well, so much is taking place in the world, and specifically in the great conflict between the superpowers, between the United States and Russia, with, of course, the pivot being the conflict in Ukraine. Now, yesterday, in my opinion, was another day of negotiations, but also another day of significant chaos, particularly in terms of news management. Now, I should say that the chaos mostly happened in Washington. In fact, it entirely happened in Washington. And I suspect that one of the factors at play was the fact that all of the major people, the important people in Washington, the president, the vice president, the national security advisor, the secretary of state, were all tied up dealing with the aftermath of the leak of the discussion to the Atlantic to Jeffrey Goldberg, which I touched on briefly yesterday. That took up most of the day from all of these people, and the result was that for a few important hours, they lost control of the media management of the discussions between Russia, the United States, and Ukraine, which had taken place in Riyadh. Now, I think it's worth, before going forward, to discuss a little bit about what happened over the previous days so that we understand better what took place yesterday. Firstly, during the conversation that took place between Putin and Trump on the 18th of March, an agreement was reached that the United States and Russia would set up expert parties to discuss the ongoing ceasefire involving attacks on energy systems, and also a potential revival of the Black Sea grain deal that was first agreed in 2022, and perhaps also work towards a wider ceasefire, a more comprehensive ceasefire, as has been proposed by the President of the United States, by Donald Trump. So that was the first move that took place. Then, over the course of last week, it was confirmed that there would indeed be meetings of expert groups that would take place in Riyadh over the course of this week, with the first meeting between the Russians and the Americans on Monday. And both the Americans and the Russians identified the people who would participate in these meetings, the meeting of this expert group. And as I've discussed in various programs, the people involved were all middle-ranking officials of the two governments. And then, over the course of last week, the United States, to be precise, Mike Waltz and Keith Kellogg, both spoke about the Ukrainians also involving themselves in the discussions in Riyadh. Now, I'm going to say, and I'm going to go a bit in advance now, and I'm going to say that apparently the Russians were not told before these announcements were made in the United States about the fact that the Ukrainians would come to Riyadh. The Russians had not been told about this in advance by the Americans. They did not expect that the Ukrainians would be present in Riyadh. They assumed that it would be purely a meeting of experts between the United States and Russia, and they were not pleased to learn that the Ukrainians would be coming along as well. And in fact, we know about this because it's been explained in a long interview. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov gave to Russian television yesterday. When the meeting in Riyadh was prepared, we agreed with the Americans, based on the arrangements made by Putin and Trump, that it would be attended by Russian and US experts. But it looks like some active guys in Washington are eager to put something on paper as soon as possible, and so they had invited the Ukrainians to Riyadh as well. The Ukrainians arrived a day before the meeting and stayed after our experts left. So what Lavrov is saying here is that the Russians weren't informed about this in advance. The initiative to call the Ukrainians to attend was made by the Americans, and the Russians believe that the American intention was to get a finalized agreement on Monday, or perhaps even yesterday, a finalized agreement which both the Russians and the Ukrainians would sign. And in fact, Lavrov goes on to say, just between ourselves, I don't think it's a big secret. We sensed before the Riyadh meeting that the Americans wanted to place Russians and Ukrainians in adjacent rooms, engaging in shuttle diplomacy to ultimately produce a coordinated document. And that was what the Americans were trying to do. They were trying to put pressure on the Russians and agree with the Ukrainians. A single statement agreed to some kind of ceasefire. And the Ukrainians, of course, leapt at this possibility, which is why they sent this very high-powered delegation led by their defense minister, Rustem Umerov, that I have spoken about in previous programs. However, the Russians would have none of it. And then we go back to what Lavrov says. We reiterated what our presidents discussed, our unequivocal stance, which had been agreed by our presidents, that progress must be reliable and there must not be any unsubstantiated documents. Even if some documents are adopted under guarantees, our American colleagues are to ensure that the Kiev regime complies with these guarantees. So the Russians basically said to the Americans, look, you've agreed to have the Ukrainians there, but this is a meeting of experts. We are not here to agree something substantive. There's not going to be a coordinated document. There's an awful lot of details to sort out. That's why this is a meeting of experts. It's not a meeting of senior officials. We don't trust the Ukrainians to comply with any big agreement, any big ticket agreement that is reached in a hurry. And before that kind of big ticket agreement is ready for signature, an awful lot needs to be sorted out and discussed and agreed before we're prepared to sign it, because we need certainty that what we do sign this time will be implemented. So that was the Russian stance, and it's clear that the Americans went along with it. The Ukrainians therefore came to Riyadh, and they found, to their annoyance and embarrassment, that they were basically frozen out of the discussions, which focused instead purely on the various technical issues that the Russians wanted to work through. And there was discussions about the ceasefire on the energy systems, the one that was agreed between Trump and Putin during their conversation on the 18th of March. But it's also clear that most of the discussion focused on the American proposal to resurrect the Black Sea Initiative, as it's sometimes referred to, the grain deal, as it's often also called, brokered in the summer of 2022 by the Turkish President Erdogan and also the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Now, I'm going to come back to the story of that agreement that was reached in 2022 when I discussed the substance of what was agreed over the course of the discussions in Riyadh over the last couple of days. But before I do that, let's just go on with the events of the day. Anyway, the two parties, the Russians and the Americans, met, and there was discussions after their meeting concluded, which is on Monday, the 24th of March, that they would publish on the 25th of March a joint statement. Now, notice that this is a statement. This was intended to be a statement. It was not an agreement. It was not a finalized agreement that would be published. It was a statement. And that statement would no doubt have explained that the Americans and the Russians had had many discussions, that significant progress in agreeing to the revival of the grain deal had been made, that there'd been also progress on fleshing out the details of the 30-day truce on attacks on energy systems, that the two sides intended to continue to meet and discuss things, and that overall the talks, the negotiations were still on track. Anyway, the day passed, yesterday passed, and no such statement appeared. And then a few hours later, over the course of the day, as I discussed in my program yesterday, a Russian official, Mr. Chizhov, who is an official of the Russian Federation Council, he is the deputy head of the Russian Federation Council's Committee on Defense and Security. He said that the reason no joint statement was published by the American and Russian governments was because the Ukrainians had objected to its publication, which meant that they had objected to its contents. And that was the position that had been reached as of the time when I made my program yesterday. Around that same time, Peskov, who was Putin's spokesman, said in public comments that since these had been technical discussions, there was no actual need to make any statements or to put anything in writing. These were technical discussions. No agreement, full agreement, final agreement had been reached. The Russian team would report to President Putin himself. He assumed that the American team would report to President Trump. But the clear guidance that came from the Russian government yesterday, as of the time when I made my program, was that there would be no further public statement over the course of that day. And that was the position, as I said, when I made my program. Now, I did discuss at very great length yesterday in my video what I thought the two parties would discuss. I said that clearly the intention was to agree to bring back the grain deal, that the Russians would almost certainly insist on a return to the terms of the grain deal that had been agreed back in the summer of 2022. Now, these terms required that commercial ships supplying foodstuffs and other goods to Ukraine should be subject to inspections to prevent arms trafficking, and that the European Union should relax sanctions to allow one specific Russian bank to be reconnected to the SWIFT system. That bank would then receive receipts from around the world for payment of the exports of certain Russian foodstuffs and mineral fertilizers, and that in turn would be followed by further decisions by the European Union to relax sanctions to enable those foodstuffs to be sold on global markets without restrictions. Now, the Russians, over the course of 2022, 2023, complained that, in fact, all of those provisions, none of those provisions were put into effect. The inspections of the Ukrainian ships didn't work. They were getting clear information that some of the ships that were sailing to Odessa, purportedly to collect grain, were also actually supplying weapons to Ukraine. They complained that food exported by Ukraine was not being exported to the global south as the grain deal envisaged, but was instead being sold to Europe. And they also complained that none of the sanctions that the Europeans had said they would lift had been lifted, that the Russian bank had not been reconnected to the SWIFT system. So they took the decision eventually in July 2023 that the grain deal obviously wasn't working and that they would pull out of it. So that was what happened last year. So anyway, that was where things stood, and not last year, in 2023, and I said in my program yesterday that I expected that in return for Russia agreeing to re-enter the grain deal, the Russians would insist that all of those provisions of the original grain deal, the reconnection of the Russian bank to SWIFT, the lifting of the sanctions of Russian agricultural exports, all of those things would be put into effect. So that was the position as of the time that I made my program. And then news began to circulate that Zelensky himself, who was clearly very frustrated and very angry about what had happened in Riyadh, that he was preparing a news conference. And then, even as his news conference was underway, or at least roughly at the time that the news conference was underway, Zelensky's news conference was underway, suddenly, and without any prior warning, the United States published, the White House published, two brief readouts about the talks that had taken place in Riyadh on the previous day. Now note that these two readouts were published just hours after, just a short time after, Peskov said that one should not expect anything in public, anything written, any written statement or comment to be published over the course of yesterday. So it's clear that the Russians did not expect these American readouts to be published, and they were blindsided by them, though, as we will see, they responded with incredible speed to the publication of these two readouts. Now, I will now read these two readouts. They're fairly short. The most important one is this one. It's outcomes of the United States and Russia expert groups on the Black Sea in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, March 23 to 25, 2025. Notice that this readout makes it clear that the topic of discussion was the Black Sea, not a general ceasefire. And this is what the American readout says. This is the readout of the American readout of the talks between the Americans and the Russians in Riyadh, the two expert groups. In line with presidential level discussions between President Trump and President Putin, the United States facilitated bilateral technical level talks with the Russian delegation March 23 to 25 in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Noticed here again that there is a clear statement that these were bilateral technical level talks. In other words, there were direct talks between the Russians and the Americans. The Ukrainians were not involved. And then we have a series of points which the Americans say were agreed. The United States and Russia have agreed to ensure safe navigation, eliminate the use of force, and prevent the use of commercial vessels for military purposes in the Black Sea. Now, notice the very careful choice of words. The United States and Russia have agreed to ensure safe navigation, eliminate the use of force, and prevent the use of commercial vessels for military purposes in the Black Sea. This is not a ceasefire agreement. In fact, it is nothing more than a statement of intention. They haven't agreed that there will be safe navigation, that there will be a ceasefire. They've agreed to ensure these particular outcomes. So this paragraph leaves open the possibility of further discussions. And then the next paragraph reads, the United States will help restore Russia's access to the world market for agricultural and fertilizer exports, lower maritime insurance costs, and enhance access to ports and payment systems for such transactions. Now, that is a clear clue that the United States, that the experts, when they met in Riyadh, agreed to all the Russian conditions. The reinstatement of SWIFT for the named Russian bank, and the lifting of sanctions on Russian agricultural exports. This is what that paragraph says. The previous paragraph also says that the United States and Russia have agreed to prevent the use of commercial vessels for military purposes in the Black Sea. So that means, in effect, that the Americans have also agreed to intrusive inspections of Ukrainian ships, or actually any ships, engaged in the grain trade in the Black Sea from Ukrainian ports. And then the American readout goes on to say the United States and Russia agreed to develop measures for implementing President Trump's and President Putin's agreement to ban strikes against energy facilities of Russia and Ukraine, the United States and Russia welcome the good offices of third countries with a view towards supporting the implementation of the energy and maritime agreements. The United States and Russia will continue working towards achieving a durable and lasting peace. And then there's some boilerplate words about how both sides want to achieve peace, an overall peace settlement in Ukraine. Now, this is very vague. It doesn't go into any details, but it makes fairly clear that the United States is agreeing to all Russian terms for reviving the Black Sea Initiative, the grain deal. Inspections of ships traveling to and from Ukrainian ports to ensure that they're not used for military purposes, in other words, transporting military equipment to Ukraine, and also lifting of sanctions on Russian agricultural exports, and the reconnection of a Russian bank or parts of the Russian financial system to SWIFT to enable payment, Russia to receive payment for those agricultural exports. And notice that it refers, the statement, the readout specifically refers to that the United States will help restore payment systems for such transactions, which in other words means SWIFT. So all of this was published, as I said, even as Zelensky was speaking, and Zelensky was talking about immediate ceasefires, immediate cessation of operations in the Black Sea. He was talking about the importance of the United States tightening up sanctions on Russia and enhancing arms deliveries to Ukraine. He spoke about a list of targets in Ukraine which would be covered by both of these ceasefires. The Ukrainians have provided this list of targets to the Americans. This includes ports and such facilities, apparently including railway systems. This is from the Ukrainian side. Zelensky was talking about all of this as if it had essentially been agreed or was in the process of being agreed. There is nothing about this anywhere in this American readout. There is nothing, for example, about the Russians being prohibited from carrying out attacks on ports or railway infrastructure or other infrastructure beyond the energy infrastructure. We'll come to that shortly. There's nothing about the United States tightening sanctions and stepping up arms deliveries or any of those things. On the contrary, the American readout makes it absolutely clear that the American intention, the agreement, the tentative agreements that had been reached by the Americans and the Russians in Riyadh was, on the contrary, to relax sanctions so as to enable the Russians to resume large-scale exports of agricultural goods. Now, as I said, the Russians were somewhat taken aback by the publication of these readouts, this readout. By the way, there is also an American readout of the American discussions with Ukraine. There's only one paragraph, in my opinion, that is relevant. It's the first one. It says the United States and Ukraine have agreed to ensure safe navigation, eliminate the use of force, and prevent the use of commercial vessels for military purposes in the Black Sea. Identical language lifted from the readout of the discussions with the Russians. In all other respects, as I said, there's the usual boilerplate words about exchanges of prisoners, releases of civilian detainees, return of forcibly transferred children to Russia, all of that. None of that, by the way, appears in the readout of the discussions between the Americans and the Russians. You can see that the Americans were clearly trying during their meeting with the Ukrainian delegation in Riyadh to soothe the Ukrainians, and that's why some of this language has appeared in the readout of the American discussion with the Ukrainians, though it is completely absent from the far more substantive readout of the discussions between the Americans and the Russians. Now, as I said, the Russians clearly did not expect those readouts, those American readouts, to be published. And to repeat again, I have no doubt that the reason the Americans rushed out these two readouts is because they were alarmed that Zelensky was in the process of putting his own spin on the discussions in Riyadh. I suspect that there are some people in the United States who now realize that it was, in fact, as the Russians imply, a mistake to invite the Ukrainians to attend in Riyadh at all, to send a delegation to Riyadh at all. And so the Americans, in order to put the record straight, in order to prevent Zelensky's account of the discussions, which talks about immediate ceasefires, preventions of attacks on ports and such things, to prevent that account of what was agreed in Riyadh gaining weight and credibility, they rushed these two readouts out themselves. And then the Russians followed, and their readout is much more detailed, and it makes clear what the Americans and the Russians agreed with each other. Now, I want to say they agreed it with each other. There's no reason to think that these points that the Americans and the Russians discussed, that there was any ultimate contention or argument about them. The meeting went on for 12 and a half hours, so probably the Americans required this all to be explained and discussed and all of that. But there's no reason to think that the Americans pushed back on any of this and that they didn't, in the end, come round to accepting all of these points which the Russians have set out in their own readout. And I will read it now. And it appears, by the way, on the Kremlin's website. So paragraph 1, in line with the agreement reached by the presidents of Russia and the United States, the Russian and American sides agreed to provide for the implementation of the Black Sea Initiative. That's the 2022 initiative. Its formal title is and always has been the Black Sea Initiative. This is not a new proposal. It is a proposal which the Russians accepted in the summer of 2022 and which has been revived. And the Russian readout goes on to say the Black Sea Initiative, which includes ensuring safe navigation, eliminating the use of force, and preventing the use of commercial vessels for military purposes in the Black Sea, while adopting control measures by inspecting such vessels. The American readout doesn't refer to inspections, though it implies it. The Russian readout makes it clear that there will be inspections. And then paragraph 2 reads, the United States will help restore Russia's access to the world market for agricultural and fertilizer exports, lower maritime insurance costs, and enhance access to ports and payment systems for such transactions. Those words are lifted directly from the American readout. I'm going to suggest that they were in the draft joint statement, the publication of which the Ukrainians rejected. And then the Russian readout becomes much more interesting, because it then goes on to say this. Note, clauses 1 and 2 will come into force following the removal of sanctions imposed on Roshel-Khozbank, Russian Agricultural Bank, and other financial institutions involved in ensuring international food trade, including fish and fish products and fertilizers, their reconnection to SWIFT, and opening of relevant correspondent accounts. The removal of restrictions imposed on trade finance operations. The removal of sanctions imposed on companies producing and exporting food, including fish and fish products, and fertilizers, as well as restrictions banning insurance companies from working with food cargoes, including fish and fish products and fertilizers. The removal of restrictions on servicing ships in ports against ships flying the flag of Russia, if they are involved in food trade, including fish and fish products and fertilizers. The removal of restrictions on supplies to the Russian Federation of agricultural machinery and other goods used in the production of food, including fish and fish products and fertilizers. Russia and the United States agreed to develop measures for implementing the agreement between the two countries' presidents to ban strikes against energy facilities of Russia and Ukraine for 30 days, starting on March 18th, 2025, with an option to extend the agreement or to withdraw from it in the event of non-compliance by either party. Now, this does not relate to the Black Sea Initiative. It relates to the 30-day energy truce, and we now have a separate statement from the Russians which makes clear which facilities are covered by the truce of attacks on energy systems. And it reads as follows. 1. Oil refineries. 2. Oil and gas pipelines and storage facilities, including pumping stations. 3. Electricity generation and transmission infrastructure, including power plants, substations, transformers, and distribution facilities. 4. Nuclear power plants. 5. Hydroelectric dams. The temporary moratorium will be enforced for 30 days, starting on March 18th, 2025, and can be extended by mutual agreement. In the event of a violation of the moratorium by either party, the other party has the right to consider itself free from obligations to comply with it. And then we go back to the main agreement. There's two further clauses. Clause 4, Russia and the United States welcome the good offices of third countries with a view towards supporting the implementation of the energy and maritime agreements. Now that is also, by the way, in the American readout. And paragraph 5, Russia and the United States will continue working towards achieving a durable and lasting peace. So, in summary, the Russians have agreed with the Americans to restore in its entirety all of the original provisions of the 2022 grain deal. That includes a very significant lifting of sanctions on a significant section of the economy. In fact, from my recollection, and of course we're talking about events of 2.5 years ago, and I'm not going to pretend that I remember all of the details, it seems to me that the sanctions relief, which appears to have been agreed in Riyadh, goes significantly beyond the sanctions relief that was agreed back in 2022. If we go back, it won't just be the removal of sanctions on the Russian Agricultural Bank, but other financial institutions involving in ensuring international food trade and their reconnection to SWIFT and opening of relevant accounts, correspondent accounts, will also be covered by the sanctions relief. Now, I'm going to make a guess here. I'm not saying this from direct knowledge, but I'm going to make a guess that all of the big Russian state banks, not just the Russian Agricultural Bank, but Sberbank, VTB especially, probably others as well, are also, all of them, involved in the export trade for Russian foodstuffs as well. And a certain reading of this paragraph means that if they are involved in the Russian food export trade, and by the way, food exports have become a major part of Russia's external trade, if they are involved in food exports, if they hold accounts whereby people pay, buyers of Russian food exports pay for those food exports, then they are covered by this provision. They should logically have their sanctions lifted as well. And we're told that companies that produce and export foods should be immune from sanctions, should have sanctions lifted. That extends to insurance companies, and I don't remember that insurance companies were in fact covered by the 2022 provisions. Of course, back in 2022, Russian insurance providers had not evolved to the level that they have today when they provide insurance for Russia's misnamed shadow fleet and such things, just saying. But apparently Russian insurance companies are also to have sanctions lifted if they work in the export trade of Russian food. And again, I'm guessing that a fair number of them do, perhaps all of them do. And Russian ships can get serviced in ports, and sanctions on them will be lifted, and the Russians can import farm machinery, much of which, by the way, is made in the United States. The United States is a major producer of farm machinery. That will no longer be covered by the sanctions. By the way, there are issues here as well, because anybody who knows anything about tractors and bulldozers and all of those things will know that tractors, by definition, work from tracks. And though I find it a massive stretch myself, because they use tracks, tanks use tracks, some people treat tractors as being dual-use goods and therefore covered by sanctions on dual-use technology. In other words, technology that can be used for both civilian and military purposes. So, major sanctions relief apparently agreed by the United States with the Russians over the course of the discussions that took place in Riyadh on Monday. Far more extensive, I believe, than what was agreed back in 2022. It's not a complete ending of the sanctions, far from it, but it is a major reduction in the scope of the sanctions. Now, all of this all of this is major sanctions relaxation, the intrusive inspections on Ukrainian ships and other ships involved in the import and export trade from Odessa and other Ukrainian Black Sea ports. In return for what exactly? Because, as I have labored to point out many times, as Putin has pointed out many times, as I remember him pointing out back in the summer of 2022, the Russians have never at any time imposed a formal blockade on the Ukrainian ports and have never interfered or overtly interfered in commercial shipping in the Black Sea. Now, I say that, I know that this is something that people push back against, but it is true. I don't remember, for example, the Russians ever seizing commercial ships in the Black Sea at any time. I don't remember the Russians boarding them or doing any of these things which Western governments regularly do with, say, Iranian ships on the high seas. Germany has just seized a Russian, or at least a ship from Russia, which in the Baltic, which they believe might have been involved in the cutting of undersea cables. There's been constant drumbeat of claims that the Russians have been busy cutting undersea cables in the Baltic, even though one regularly gets admissions that there is in fact absolutely no evidence that this is the case. But I don't remember the Russians ever doing this in the Black Sea. And you will find now in several places in the media admissions of what is actually true. That not only are there no restrictions on commercial shipping in the Black Sea, but commercial shipping from Ukrainian Black Sea ports continues pretty much as normal. I read, for example, this comment from a Ukrainian official. He says, this is Mr. Goncharenko, Oleksiy Goncharenko. He's perhaps more accurately described as a Ukrainian politician. He's a member of the Ukrainian parliament. He said that he doesn't understand the purpose of the proposed deal, which, as far as he can see, simply benefits Russia. They demanded that sanctions be lifted, and the Americans have basically agreed that all of these sanctions be lifted. And he said, and I'm taking this from the Daily Telegraph, Russia is making new demands that sanctions should be lifted, but for what? For commercial ships to move. They moved today and yesterday. I have a lot of questions and no answers. And this is absolutely true. There is no restrictions on commercial shipping in the Black Sea whatsoever. So, again, it's not clear or obvious, at least to me, what the Russians are supposed to have conceded as a result of these talks in Riyadh. They made a whole list of demands for sanctions relief in order to re-enter a grain deal that they agreed in 2022. All of those requests for sanctions relief appear to have been conceded by the Americans, and in return the Russians have given nothing substantive back whatsoever. I will come to this in a moment because I think that is putting it a little dogmatically. But anyway, if one looks at this in these hard terms, that is indeed what we have just seen. Now, to repeat again, you find a long, much narrative discussion across the Western media that the reason why Ukrainian ships, commercial shipping in the Black Sea, continues unaffected is because the Ukrainians somehow achieved some great naval victory in the Western Black Sea, and that they drove the Russian Navy out of the Western Black Sea. To repeat again a point I have made many times, this is nonsense. It is fiction. If the Russians really did want to impose a blockade on Ukrainian Black Sea ports, they have ample means to do so. They have naval submarines in the Black Sea. I believe there's 6 of them. These submarines, when they're underwater, are beyond Ukraine's ability to reach. They could use those submarines to impose a secure zone in the Black Sea, forbidding ships from traveling there under threat of being fired at. They could plant mines in abundance in the Black Sea, and mines can be dropped from the air as well as by sea, just saying. The Russian Air Force regularly patrols all parts of the Black Sea, and we now know that Sukhoi 57 stealth fighter jets regularly now patrol all parts of the Black Sea, including its western part. The Russians also have full and comprehensive missile coverage of every part of the Black Sea. If the Russians were to announce tomorrow that no commercial ship is permitted to enter or exit a Ukrainian port, I can pretty much guarantee that no ship owners, except perhaps a few very, very reckless ones, would allow their ships to enter this area of the Black Sea or to go to commercial ports, Ukrainian commercial ports. And the insurance companies, Lloyd's and the others, would refuse to provide insurance for any ships entering that sort of war zone. The Russians have never done that, and they show no desire to do so. I think they did contemplate it at various times. I think they considered doing it in the early weeks of the special military operation when they occupied Snakes Island, for example. I think they also considered doing it in the summer of 2023 when they pulled out of the grain deal. In fact, I thought at the time that they were going to do it. The reason they didn't do it in the end is not because they don't have those capabilities. It is because, as they quickly discovered, blockading Ukrainian ports would have created a very, very strongly negative response against Russia across the global south. Global south countries seek to import grain and other foodstuffs from Ukraine at a time of high inflation. It would seem as if the Russians were preventing the export of that food to countries that needed it. Putin pointed out that most of the food was going to Europe. Putin offered, as I remember, food supplies, free food supplies to global south countries. And notwithstanding all of that, the countries of the global south made it absolutely clear that though they were happy to accept the free food and all of that, they still were extremely sensitive. In fact, they were extremely hostile to any and every move that might restrict the export of food from Ukraine, which has been historically a major food exporter. So for that reason, the Russians didn't do it, notwithstanding that it was in their full power to do it. So the Russians substantively have conceded nothing. They are not interfering with commercial shipping in the Black Sea. You see that Mr. Goncharenko from Ukraine admits as much, but they have got a promise from the United States that it will engage in very extensive sanctions relief, or try to achieve very extensive sanctions relief on behalf of Russia. And that promise is something that the Russians took away from the meeting in Istanbul, and it is what has unsettled the Ukrainians. Now, I am going to say straight away that Zelensky, in my opinion, over the course of yesterday, behaved in an erratic and bizarre way to a point such as I have barely seen. He was making up agreements which don't exist. He was claiming that things have been that the Russians are doing things that they're clearly not doing. He's making more demands for more weapons and more supplies and more money and more sanctions, which are completely at odds with the discussions that the Americans and the Russians conducted with each other. And he is complaining bitterly that the Americans and the Russians are talking to each other directly and that Ukraine is not involved. And he's very worried that the Americans are listening to the Russians rather than listening to him. And he's complaining bitterly about this. And he has already, on several occasions, but again, the day before the talk started, he complained that the Americans are becoming influenced by what Zelensky calls Russian propaganda. And, well, we have an agreement which, in that respect, comes close to fulfilling his worst fears. The Americans have come to an agreement with the Russians for Ukrainian and other commercial ships traveling to Ukrainian ports to be inspected, to be subjected to intrusive inspections, and for a very wide measure of sanctions relief to be granted to the Russians. Now, saying this, the sanctions in question, the reconnection of the Russian Agricultural Bank to SWIFT, the reconnection of the other banks, Russian banks to SWIFT, the lifting of sanctions on Russian food exports, the lifting of sanctions on Russian insurers, and the provision of insurance to Russian ships that are involved in the food export trade. That all of that technically is within the jurisdiction of the European Union. These are not sanctions that directly affect the United States. The United States does provide some maritime insurance, but the main centre of maritime insurance in the West has been London, just saying. And many of the other sanctions, the sanctions on food exports and that kind of thing, repairs of ships, Russian ships, and that sort of thing, all of that falls within the province of the Europeans. And it is the Europeans who must make a decision whether or not Russian banks can be reconnected to SWIFT, because SWIFT is based in Europe, in Belgium to be precise, and is therefore under the EU's jurisdiction. Now, that is a very tall order. Today, the European Commission has published a statement, well, its spokesman has made a statement, that the EU is not prepared to relax any sanctions on Russia at all. They will not do so until all Russian troops leave the entire territory of Ukraine, including presumably Crimea. That's the stance that the European Commission is taking. Completely unsurprising. It is the stance that Britain, which, as I said, is the home of a large proportion of the maritime insurance industry, is also taking. Now, as I said, this has a long history because the original grain deal in 2022 collapsed precisely because the Europeans and the British were not prepared to relax their sanctions. We have a long account of all of this from Lavrov. Lavrov, as I said, gave this interview to Russian television yesterday. I should say that when he gave this interview, it was before the Americans published their readouts, and I don't think that the Russians at that time were expecting that the readouts would indeed be published. But anyway, this is what Lavrov had to say about this. He discusses this all at very considerable length, and he says this: the first attempt to set up this Black Sea deal dates back to July 2022. Back then, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres and President Erdogan mediated with the specialists who represented Ukraine and Russia, and came to terms on a certain package that was made up of two parts. The first part provided fast-track solutions to shipping Ukrainian grain across the Black Sea via the Dardanelles, which included ship inspections to preclude cheating, where empty runs for a new batch of grain could be used to deliver weapons. Inspection procedures were agreed and remained operational for the entire year. However, we were then forced to suspend the process, or at least to pause it, because the second part of the deal that concerned removal of all obstacles to Russian grain and fertilizer exports was flat out sabotaged. All ships that carried Russian agricultural products, including fertilizer, continued to be blacklisted. Lloyd's, the insurer, hiked up its rates. Payments for our products were impeded as well. The Russian Agricultural Bank was disconnected from SWIFT. Much was done to send prices sky high. The West did everything to skew the rules in favor of Ukraine and to punish us as much as it could. A year after the Black Sea deal had taken effect, Guterres threw up his hands and said that he was unable to get things right. We suggested getting back to this deal whenever he regained the ability. We just bailed out from our part of the deal, which is approved for just 1 year. The year ran out. We did not want to renew the deal. And then Lavrov complains about Guterres essentially accepting the validity of the sanctions, and the Russians consider the sanctions to be illegal. And anyway, Lavrov then goes on to say that our negotiators in Riyadh were assigned this mission by President Putin, reminding their US counterparts of what happened before. And given Ukraine's track record and the Black Sea incident in question, we would like to leave ambiguity out of whatever agreement we may reach this time. So, if the Europeans maintain their stance, then the Black Sea deal will not be revived, because the Russians are saying that it is conditional on that sanctions relief, and if it is not granted, if that sanctions relief is not granted, then we've moved no further forward from what happened in 2022, 2023, and the deal cannot come into effect. So the Russians are saying it's up to the Europeans, just as it was in 2022. Now, Where does this leave us? The ball, in a sense, is in the Europeans' court. Do they lift the sanctions or don't they? At the moment, they're saying that they won't. Back in 2022, however, they had the full backing of the Biden administration, which basically supported the stance that sanctions should not be lifted. Now the Trump administration wants the grain deal restored, and it is saying that it agrees with the Russians that the sanctions should be lifted. The Europeans are not united on this issue. Just before I did this program, there was confirmation that the Hungarian Foreign Minister Peter Szijjártó is heading to Moscow. It could be that Hungary, Slovakia, some other European countries are going to come round to American thinking, and they're going to start pressuring the Commission and other European countries to comply with these provisions. It could be. There has been a very ugly hit piece in the British media today by the Daily Telegraph against the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. There are complaints that Meloni is opting out of the coalition of the willing. She's not prepared to participate. Italy is not prepared to participate in Starmer's idea of sending peacekeeping forces to Ukraine and all of that. Meloni refused to send an Italian military official to participate in the Chief of Staff talks that the British held, that Starmer convened in London. Apparently the only military chiefs that attended those talks came from Britain and France, and as I've discussed in a recent video, the British military officials came back and told Starmer in no uncertain terms that this will not work. If the Americans stand by what they agreed with the Russians in Riyadh, then possibly Italy, Hungary, other European states will align with the Americans on this, and it could be that the pressure on the Europeans, on those who want to hold out for the sanctions, will grow to the point that the Europeans crack. Clearly the Commission doesn't want to lift or relax sanctions. The administration, the Trump administration, however, has clearly no time for the Commission. It's been noticed by many people that there have been no direct contacts between the Trump administration and the European Commission since Trump took office. It may be that the Americans will tell the Europeans, you must lift the sanctions. We're committed to getting this grain deal back on track. You've got to lift the sanctions. You've got to relax sanctions in the way that we agreed with the Russians. And there'll be more and more European states coming round. And the global south will probably also support this, and perhaps possibly the sanctions will indeed be relaxed and the grain deal in its original form will be reinstated. I have to say, however, that even if that does not happen, even if these results in Riyadh produced no substantive result at all, that still doesn't mean that this was a worthless exercise. To repeat again, there is no obstruction anyway in trade in the Black Sea. So the Russians and the Americans are talking about a topic which has a certain academic quality about it. The fact that they're able to sit down, that they're able to speak for 12 and a half hours, that they're able to come to agreements, that those agreements involve lifting sanctions, that they're able to agree on what energy facilities should not be attacked, that they have discussed apparently some kind of inspection regime, and they're talking about third parties that could be involved in conducting those inspections. We're not told who those third parties are, but again, the implication is that they will mostly come from the Middle East, maybe from Saudi Arabia itself or other countries, that they will send inspectors, that they will do the research to make sure that the energy truce is being complied properly or being performed properly, or if the Black Sea initiative is ever revived, that the ships will be inspected properly. Well, all of that moves this process forward. It takes us closer to the point where a consensus between the Americans and the Russians is reached, and we get closer to a framework agreement which the Americans and the Russians have all but agreed will be on the basis of Istanbul Plus. Now, I say this, I discussed at very great length in my program yesterday how a report that has appeared in the Moscow Times, that the Russians have told the Americans that the entirety of the 4 regions must be transferred to Russia and that there must be diplomatic recognition of this. I've said already that I regard this report as unreliable. I believe that that is the Russian position. In fact, I have no doubt that it is, but I do not do so on the basis of that report in the Moscow Times. Now, the purpose of that report in the Moscow Times, and I'm now seeing it all over the European media, was rather to insist on the claim attributed to this Russian official supposedly interviewed by the Moscow Times that the Russians are out to spin out the negotiations. I don't believe that any senior Russian official would have shared that kind of information with the Moscow Times. Just saying, just to repeat again, the Moscow Times is regarded in Russia as a hostile news outlet. There are legal penalties for Russian officials contacting it. I cannot believe that any Russian official would have spoken to the Moscow Times, senior Russian official would have spoken to the Moscow Times in that respect. This is increasingly looking to me like somebody who wants to undermine any prospect of negotiations between the Americans and the Russians, inserting that story into the Moscow Times so that it can be republished and repeated elsewhere in order to undermine Donald Trump's faith in negotiations with the Russians. And Trump, by the way, has commented indirectly on that story. He says, yes, possibly, the Russians are spinning things out. It's not surprising. It's a common negotiating tactic. I've done it myself many times in my business career. So for the moment, at least, he is not taking that very seriously. He still feels, or appears to feel, that he is moving forward with the Russians, and the discussions in Riyadh strongly suggest that, at least to me. Trump may have a particular reason to do this, to think this way. I'm sorry, my voice is now just about run through. But just to say that the other big event of the last 24 hours has been that the US intelligence community seems finally to be coming round to an acceptance that the Russians are indeed winning the war in Ukraine. Now, we've had that in 2 statements. that the US intelligence community has published. One was from the chair of the Defense Intelligence Agency. In testimony to Congress, he said that the Russians have momentum, that they are continuing to advance, and that Russia has greater resilience and will be able to keep moving forward longer than Ukraine can. But perhaps an even stronger statement was made in the US intelligence community's annual assessment of the intelligence situation there. Latest assessment, which is their annual threat assessment of the US intelligence community, which was published yesterday. Now, many people are saying that this is the product of Tulsi Gabbard's appointment as Director of National Intelligence. However, she only became Head of National Intelligence on the 12th of February. I doubt that she's had the time to involve herself in the details of the preparation of this particular document. So, I doubt that she's had a huge input. More interesting, however, is what the document has to say about the situation in Ukraine, and I suspect that this is in the conflict in Ukraine and what the Russians are doing in the war in Ukraine. And I suspect that this assessment predates Gabbard's appointment. Anyway, it says this: even though Russian President Putin will be unable to achieve the total victory he envisaged when initiating the large-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Russia maintains momentum as a grinding war of attrition plays to Russia's military advantages. This grinding war of attrition will lead to a gradual but steady erosion of Kiev's position on the battlefield, regardless of any US or Allied attempts to impose new and greater costs on Moscow. It's the last part of the last sentence that matters. Regardless of any US or Allied attempts to impose new and greater costs on Moscow. The Russians are winning the war, and there is nothing that the West can do. Cranking up sanctions is not going to change the situation. Providing Ukraine with more weapons is not going to change the situation. That, I suspect, is the message the intelligence community is giving, not just to Donald Trump, but to the US political class as a whole. And it is that which is driving the policy, which has led the United States to shift its position, taking advantage of the change in administrations to be able to do it. And, well, maybe this negotiation will not succeed. Maybe obstruction from the Europeans and the Ukrainians will be too strong in the end. Maybe it will all fail. At which point, my own guess is that the US will indeed gradually slow down its support for Ukraine. After all, what more can it do? And is it realistic for the United States to come back to Congress and ask for more weapons and more funding for Ukraine when the US intelligence community itself says that that won't change the eventual outcome? That is what is driving the policy, not Donald Trump's biases or his feelings about Putin or any of that. It is the realities of the war itself and how it is playing out in the economy and on the battlefield. Well, here, my friends, I have to stop. As you see, my voice is now starting to break down. I apologise for this, but there's nothing I can do. So there's more to say, but I'll be saying it tomorrow in my next programme. I predict my voice will be a lot better then. And apologies again, and just to remind you, you can find all our programmes on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. And last but not least, if you like this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.